Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Welcome back. This is Talking Books and Writing and Stuff, and today we're talking about books and writing and whole lots of other stuff. Should be quite interesting with Mark Henick. Mark Henick, the book is right in front of me. It's called So-Called Normal. Mark, a question that guys ask each other, but it never seems to get the right answer. How are you doing today?
I'm really well. It's been certainly a journey since the book has come out to open myself up in such a raw way to so many people. But it's coming back down to earth now, which I think is good.
And the book is called So-Called Normal. The question, of course, would be, well, what is normal then? If you're a so-called normal but not normal, what is normal? Does anybody ever have an answer to that?
I don't think we do, and that was part of my quest in doing the book. I think I later realized it was that I had been living much of my life striving for this so-called normal, whatever it is, as though it's something that everybody else had figured out and everybody else had access to, but I didn't. And I had lived my whole life just wanting to be normal because I grew up with a severe and persistent mental illness, with depression, with anxiety. I suffered through multiple suicide attempts and trauma at home, and I just wished more than anything else that I could be normal. And I think it was only much later in my career, when I talked to many, many other people through my podcasts and through my work, that I realized we're all just making this up as we go, that there isn't some brass ring out there, some perfect version of normal, that we're all just making it up as we go. So, I think that's what I realized in writing the book.
I think I've come to realize that now a bit later in life as I enter, my 70s or something. Yes, I've always tried to be like other people, but I didn't want to be like other people. So that was a big ball of confusion, as the Temptations would say. For me, So-Called Normal from Mark Henick, a memoir of family, depression, and resilience. And I'm sure everybody asks you this question, but have you ever found the man in the brown coat?
I did, and actually it was, one of the most healing parts of my story, I think, was when more than a dozen years later, I was able to go back and I had no idea how I would do it or what I would do, but I had developed relationships in media by that point. I had started writing for newspapers, and then I was doing some television. So I called up a producer at what was then Canada's most watched morning news program, Canada AM, and I explained this incredible urge that I had gotten more than a dozen years later to find the stranger who saved my life. I mean, I had already talked about him in my TED Talk, which had been seen by millions of people, and I didn't even really fully know if he was real, if he really existed. So I asked this producer at that morning news program if I could come on TV and if I could ask the public's help in finding the stranger. All that I knew was that he was wearing a light brown jacket, and 12 years ago he pulled me off a bridge late at night. And sure enough, I went on live. They showed some clips of the TED Talk. I asked for the public's help in finding him there, as well as on my social media platforms, Twitter and Facebook. And within about an hour, I started getting leads for who this guy was. And eventually it turned out that he had just found out that I was still alive a week before I went on national television to look for him. And he had already written me a letter in case someday he ever found me. So they sent me the letter, and we reconnected from there.
This is Talking Books and Writing and Stuff, talking with Mark Henick. The book is So-Called Normal, and the reason we're talking about the brown-coated man was right on the opening flap. When Mark Henick was a teenager in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, he was tortured by depression and anxiety, almost took his own life. One night he stood on the bridge of an overpass, clinging to a girder in the wind. One person shouted to him, "Jump, you coward!" Another man, a random stranger in a brown coat, talked to him quietly, calmly, and with deep empathy. And so the man in the brown coat, as we like to call him, saved your life without sugarcoating it at all. He saved your life. It's like the what is it? It's a Wonderful Life, the Jimmy Stewart movie where he's about to jump off the bridge and then the angel comes and talks to him. So it's almost as if this guy came out of nowhere, like he was a savior sent from the gods of hockey or something. So
Very much so, and he talked to me and got to know me, and that was part of what saved my life, I think, from that point forward. But he also literally had to reach out, and when I let go of the railing, he had to reach out. He wrapped his arm around me, and he dragged me backward over the railing because I was on the wrong side of the railing on about 1.5 inches or so of concrete. So he very literally saved my life. But then I much later learned, when I found him, that he was actually the one who gave me my whole life from that point forward. I wanted to be like that stranger in the light brown jacket who saved people's lives and who connected with them. So that's what really, that moment is what gave me my purpose for the rest of my life.
So-Called Normal is the book with Mark Henick, talking about resiliency and mental illness. Now, we've had Alan Kaler on our program a couple of times, and his book, one of it, was called Born Resilient. So this word seems to resonate in the, I'll say, the mental health field, but what is that all about? What resilience are we talking about here?
I think that there's a misconception in some ways that resilience is that you never have bad times, that you never struggle, that it's only good days, and that you're one of those so-called happy people. And that's not what resilience is. Resilience isn't about how you stay up. It's about how you bounce back when you're down. It's about the springiness of your mood, of your well-being, and how able you are to come back from adversity. And the only way that you can build your resilience, in my opinion anyway, is to practice it. It's to be down and then to do the work of getting back up again. That's how you practice resilience. You don't practice resilience by always pretending that everything is rosy and great, because that's not reality.
Mark Henick is with us. You started therapy at 13. When I was 13, I barely knew how to select my own socks. What it's like having somebody probe into the deep, dark recesses of your mind when you barely know your own mind yourself. What was that like for you?
Yeah, for me, as a young man, I only ever received very introductory kind of therapy, because that's all that was available in my rural hometown. We didn't have, big city therapists or big in-depth or super progressive types of psychotherapy. We had your fairly basic, or what we now know as basic, cognitive behavioral therapy. And even then, it wasn't super structured. But I did get the opportunity to receive this type of therapy very early on, and it helped. It helped me to feel like I had some control over my own mind, because I think so many of my struggles were, at least in part, feeling like I had no control over myself or my circumstances or even my own thoughts and feelings. So one of the things that I noticed in writing my book was that while I struggled for a really long time, for most of my childhood and young adulthood, when I got the help that I needed, it helped. And then when I lost or didn't get the help that I needed, I got worse. It really wasn't rocket science. And in my clinical work, I've noticed this with so many people too. They're struggling so much, and it's because they're not getting the help that they need. And it's help that exists out there, but they're not getting connected with it in a meaningful way. And that, for me, is a tragedy.
And the other tragedy seems to be the person you talked about in your book who says jump when you're on the edge of the bridge. And our son has been a couple of times hospitalized, and he was out looking through a window once in the psych ward, we'll call it, because that's what he calls it, and a guy walks by and gives him the finger. So like, why would people, or circles his fingers around the ear, like to give that cuckoo crazy motion we used to do back before we knew better? Why would people do that? Are they deep down afraid that they would do the same thing, or they just think that they're so tough that nothing like that would bother them?
I think that it comes down fundamentally to disconnection. And I really meditated and thought and prayed and spoke about this dynamic that happened for me in that very fragile moment when I was on the edge of that bridge, literally ready to die. And in many ways, in my mind, I wouldn't have been able to get back anyway. I could have slipped and fallen just as easily as I had wanted to jump. But it really came down to these two strangers, even though by that point there was a crowd of people around me. one, the stranger in the light brown jacket, who had my back, literally. He was standing right behind me. He was talking to me, getting to know me, really empathetic and taking the time to see me. And then there was this other guy who was standing on the sidelines. Again, literally, the police had set up yellow wooden sawhorse barricades, and he was there with his friends on the sidelines, who shouted these things out. And it really set into stark relief for me the two choices that all of us have at every moment in our lives. We can see people for who they really are in all the drama and all the pain and suffering that they're going through, or we can choose not to. We can choose to stand on the sidelines and to treat people as objects, as though they're just spectacles. And I think that was the other half of the equation for me. As much as I chose to be, in a very, I think, rudimentary way, like the stranger who reached out and saved me, I was also choosing to reject that other way, reject the sidelines, reject the disconnection that drive people to do and say things like that.
And we talk about the mental health stigma all the time, but we haven't got past that. And I've been talking, I don't know, 20 years I've heard that we have to break the stigma. So what's holding things back, do you think? Or is it just one of those slow societal evolutionary processes like wearing seat belts? I hate to put it such a crude comparison, but 50 years ago, no one wears seatbelts. Now nobody complains about it at all. So,
yeah,
what's the stigma thing? Sorry.
Likewise, we can relate it to smoking as well. When it was just suggested by doctors that maybe smoking isn't very good for you, nobody really listened. But then all of a sudden, you can't smoke in hospitals or restaurants or most other public places anymore, and that's when we see smoking rates finally start to decline in meaningful ways. So I think that it's similar to stigma as well. That we're at an early stage, even though it's been 15, 20 years of talking really openly about mental health. Generationally speaking, that's still a pretty early stage. And I think we have made good headway in a very basic sense of breaking down a stigma and raising awareness of mental health. But we certainly have a long way to go. And I think that's partly because we still need to make meaningful, actionable changes, whether they're policy changes, government funding to mental health programs, for example, changes to workplaces where it's actually enforced that you can't be fired or disciplined for having a mental health problem or illness. We still see these kinds of violations happening all the time. We still see stats like most people wouldn't want to get into a relationship with somebody with a mental illness, or most people think that there's a correlation between violence and mental illness, and there's really not. So I think that, we've scratched the surface, and that's a good thing. We know that millennials and younger are more likely than any older generation to recognize that they might have a mental health problem and then to reach out for help. But we still haven't really cracked the systemic issues that are deeply informed by stigma that prevent people from getting better.
And talking now with Mark Henick. The book is So-Called Normal. It's a memoir of family, depression, and resilience. So writing the memoir, how did your family handle it?
One of the best pieces of advice that I read very early on in the memoir writing process was from the writer Anne Lamott, who said that you own your story. You own everything that happened to you. And people might have experienced the exact same things very differently, but nobody else can tell you what your story is or how you've been traumatized or how you interpreted or experienced your experience. So that was, I really relied on that advice and that stream of advice throughout the writing process, that this is how I remember it. This is how it happened to me. This is my truth. And that's all that really matters. I'm not telling anybody else's story. So I think that when I really focused in on this is what I need to do for myself and for my late mother to tell our story, that really made it a lot easier for me.
And the next question I had was almost answered. I was going to ask, what's the best advice you'd ever received, aside from memoir writing advice? Anything else resonate with you down through the years?
Oh, I mean, I think I'm a compendium of all of the advice I've been given over the years. I wouldn't be who I am if not for all the advice I've gotten. But one of the more influential things I think that germinated from me from an early age was this idea that you don't have to believe everything that you think. That we all fall, mental illness or not, into this trap of thinking that just because I said it to myself in my own voice, or just because it came into my head, that it must be true. And that's not always the case. Thoughts and feelings are useful, but they're data points. That's all. They don't have to mean anything. You can think that somebody is a jerk, or you can think that you need to be really upset by this thing, or you can feel this or that way, but you don't have to stay stuck there, because it's information that we need to pay attention to, but we don't have to put that much stock in our thoughts and feelings. You might think that you're useless or worthless, or that nothing will ever get better, and that doesn't mean it's true.
Thank you. And this is Mark Henick here on Talking Books, So-Called Normal. What can so-called normal people do to sort of break the stigma or to help others who might be suffering?
One of the most effective ways to break mental health stigma is something called contact-based education. And this is not only true for mental health problems and illnesses, but really across the board of helping people to understand anything. And what it means is that when people come into contact with the stories of others who have actually been through the thing that is being stigmatized, that's what helps people to understand the best. You can read about it in books, you can watch it on TV, and that might help a little bit, but you really need to get your hands dirty, to get into the trenches, to get to know people's stories who have been through these kinds of struggles. So that's what I would encourage everybody to do, is to share your own story and how it relates, how mental health problems and illnesses relate to your own life, but then also reach out and really listen non-judgmentally to the stories of others. And when we do that at the individual level, societies are just collections of individuals after all. Right. So if we can break down stigma in the individual, that's what's going to defeat stigma at the societal level.
And talking about mental health issues with Mark Henick, the book is So-Called Normal. Mark, what is mental health? Everybody talks about mental illness. What is mental unillness in your view?
Yeah, in my view, mental health is something that everybody has. If you have a brain, then you have mental health. You can't not have mental health. And then I see mental illness as an occasional interruption into that more people than you would think experience. But I like to think of mental health as the house, and mental illness as sometimes the intruder into the house. So we all have a role to play, and we all actually need to pay attention to our mental health. That should an intruder of mental illness creep in there every now and then we address it early, and we keep ourselves in as strong of mental health as possible, because not only does that help to prevent mental illnesses in us, it also helps others to see somebody who is taking good care of their own mind.
And with the book So-Called Normal, and with your TED Talks and other appearances, what do you hope, I guess, is there in a nutshell the message you hope resonates with people?
Well, I think we need to better normalize everyday conversations about mental health, about mental illness, even about our deepest, darkest struggles. Because when we make it normal to talk about these kinds of issues, then it increases the likelihood that people will seek and get the help that they need when they're struggling. So let's just talk about these issues that everybody is already dealing with anyway. Let's just talk about them that way. Talk about them as factual. That's what they are. And that's what I hope people take from my story too, that these are stories that have happened to me, that happen to a lot of people, and it's perfectly okay to open up about your story.
And is it true that men are more reticent to talk about their inner demons, inner struggles than, say, women?
Yes, it is. There's been a significant amount of research on this, and this is also why we see that that suicide disproportionately affects men, staggeringly so. And it's this socialized idea that you have to man up, that you have to suck it up, and that you can't be weak, and all these lies that we were told since we were very little, that I was told since I was a little boy, and it serves no purpose. Really, you're stronger for being able to open up about your struggles and deal with it, to face it head on, rather than fall into the myth that if you just push it away, it'll go away. That's rarely the case.
Mark Henick, one last question. If people want to book you for an appearance or further explore this situation, how can they easily contact you?
I'm widely accessible on social media for sure, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And I'm also proudly represented by Speakers Spotlight if you have an event where you would like me to come in and tell my story live.
And that's Mark Henick. Book is So-Called Normal. Go out, take a look at it. It's from HarperCollins, and it is just one of the many sort of a new wave of books and talks and speeches and thoughts that are helping erase in small ways each and every day the stigma against mental illness. Mark Henick, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.